M.Anifest has taken that formula and he represents a kind of rapper that I would like to call the Pan-African rapper. He is conscious about his vision as an African. He's conscious about coming from Ghana and understanding the politics of the rest of the world in relation to Africa. The fact that African Americans might love us, but it's from a romantic place of what they've lost. And they don't understand the everyday experiences of an African. What's up, Headspaces? My name is Viwe Joka. They call me the brother from the ancient mother. If you're watching this, you're watching the segment where we do album reviews on the Headspace, Africa's most poignant hip-hop podcast. What we do is that we focus on the hip-hop happening around Africa, and let's get to the core, the crux, the center of how, where, and why hip-hop has become so undeniably pivotal and important across the continent. Now, this review is a first of one of the many, let's call them Pan-African reviews. We're based in South Africa, and for the most part we do South African artists. We focus on South African rap, the history of South African hip-hop, but it dawned on the team that you can't talk about South African hip-hop and still negate the rest of the transference of hip-hop throughout the rest of the continent. And I think the only reason why we didn't do this earlier is a sense of nervousness about crossing the quote-unquote proverbial borders. Africa is a country that many say country deliberately, because the rest of the world looks at this continent as a country. So it might as well be. Because if we're looking at the borders, the conceptual analogy and the reality of a border and a country and a continent is defined by whoever is in power. And if we look at what Africa is as an invention, as a concept, it was made by us. We would move freely across different tribes, navigating our own cultural units in ways that were about the survival of people within their own personal context. So yeah, if you want to call it a country, call it a country. If you want to call it a whole universe, call it a universe. As the rapper who I'm going to review does, M.Anifest, all the way from Ghana, give us a project called Madina To The Universe, the EP.ilogue or the epilogue, which is really a tie-in into his previous album, Madina To The Universe, same name. So this is one story, and for that particular reason, I've got to talk about both projects. So let's step back to the introduction. We fundamentally were doing hip-hop that's based in South Africa, but the impulse and the strong urge to go beyond the boundaries of South Africa was inevitable, because when we're talking about the development of Africans in the context of hip-hop in the rest of the world, M.Anifest's name has to be part of that conversation. It makes me think of how the large majority of our commentary is based on this conversation between Africa and the rest of the world, particularly Africa and the West. Africa and Europe, Africa and the United States of America, and the fact that because hip-hop traveled through the diaspora, that is, dispossessed Africans who ended up in the West as their DNA calling back to them in the form of experiences which came about by the context of their own inner city struggle. Hip-hop was an expression of two things: an African nostalgia for the ideal freedom that they lost, but also an expression of the Western oppression that they were experiencing. So as a result, hip-hop mirrors two things. It mirrors what Africans aspire to access, this embodied expression of feeling like their bodies and their minds are respected in a world that allows them to be who they are, which obviously the world hasn't. Historically, Africans have been a wildly oppressed and intensely suppressed people by a culture that has wielded its gauntlets across the whole entire world, universe, if it had the strength to. So when it comes to telling the story of hip-hop, we have to understand that our conversations as Africans with hip-hop is always under the watchful eye of the American guys, and with guys and gays, really, both of them, because it is under the American gaze that we learn to see ourselves as Africans. That is to say, we aspire for the things we've seen in the music videos. We aspire to be the kind of Africans who feel global, the kind of Africans who look like the world accepts them, the kind of Africans who represent a greater consciousness of quote-unquote black excellence. And those Africans tend to be sold to us as Africans in the Americas or Africans in the UK. And as a result, for us in the continent, we learn that these are the Africans to be. For them in the West, they're experiencing the opposite. They're in a country with radical racist nuances where their art is one of the few ways that they're able to channel some semblance of freedom. And they look at us and envy our direct continuance and our direct contact with tradition, with history, with a sense of ourselves. So this mutual sense of envy, this mutual sense of aspiration, of Africans wanting to jump into the window of the global African archetype and Africans in the Americas wanting to jump into the window of an African with an historical awareness, is a conversation that has taken place for many years. When we're talking about the establishment of great African leaders and the development of empires and the falling of kingdoms, when we're talking about people being brought to slavery, it is this conversation between the Africans in the continent and the Africans in the West that has brought about the experience that M.anifest as an artist epitomizes through his music. And what do I mean by that? A lot of rappers in Africa, South Africa included, any part of Africa, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Ghana, Nigeria, tend to be so closed into this globalist African perspective that when they rap, they automatically rap for a Western audience, neglecting aspects of their rich rhythmic heritage in order to fit into a very monotonous configuration of music that is determined by Western ears and a very Western sonic texture. But every now and again, you have African artists who learn that the only way art can speak to people from a deeper place is when you tell the story of where you come from and learn to appreciate the aspects of the cultures that you stem from. Now, M.anifest has taken that formula and he represents a kind of rapper that I would like to call the Pan-African rapper. He is conscious about his vision as an African. He's conscious about coming from Ghana and understanding the politics of the rest of the world in relation to Africa. The fact that African Americans might love us, but it's from a romantic place of what they've lost. And they don't understand the everyday experiences of an African. They don't understand how urban Africa is. They don't understand how westernized we've become. They don't thoroughly understand the complexities and the conflicts that we have amongst ourselves of not meeting the ends of many things we wanted to achieve within our governments and our culture. So as a result, the watered down version of Africa you get from CNN or Fox News is an Africa that's packaged for an American audience. It's the thin kid with boils and kwashiorkor. It's the food aid being dropped down from planes. It's the Somali pirates. It is negativity being romanticized into the poverty of a nation which cannot help itself and always needs the rest of the world to help it. And as a result, many Africans, African artists included, have internalized this need to be celebrated by the West before they celebrate themselves, because they've internalized this narrative that Africa cannot help itself. Africa needs the West to gain its own dignity, respect, and greatness. Now, whether or not that is true or not, it ties into the consciousness that M.anifest and rappers like him, but him particularly in this review, break. M.anifest is learned in the roots of African rhythm, and that's primarily because he is the grandson of one of Africa's most notable ethnomusicologists. And I think this plays a major role in having a family member who actually studied and was a teacher and a relayer of the rich heritage of Africa's music. There's no way you can run away from the lessons of valuing your own rhythmic tones. And I feel like as a producer, he takes this with him in the hip-hop he embeds in warm tones that are rich with the Ghanaian rhythms. And as a result, as a South African, I can only speak from a South African rhythmic perspective, but as an African, I understand the unified threads that make up the African rhythms, the polyrhythmic tones of our drums, the talking drums, the percussive elements that make up Africa's spirit, the dynamics of the fact that in Africa, throughout Africa, music and dance are synonymized in the same breath. To us, if you can talk, you can sing. If you can sing, you can dance. If you can dance, you can count the beat. And if you can count the beat, you are alive, because this is what music represents. It's the highest form of celebrating life, celebrating the African life. And this is exactly what M.anifest does with his rich catalog. This man's been rapping since the early 2000s, really. And I'm talking about a particular project, this two-part project, Madina To The Universe. Madina obviously being in Accra, and him taking that to the rest of the world. And how does he take it to the rest of the world? Like with all of the projects that he's been doing, M.anifest is first and foremost a griot in the tradition of his people. He's a poet on behalf of Ghana, but he's also a poet on behalf of Africa. And he has stretched out his hands to understand the subtle political nuances of that African story. See, what makes M.anifest such a unique MC is that he's a poet first. He speaks from a place of sincerity, openness, and a very minimalistic attention to detail, to the intention and the value of words as they empower. And Madina To The Universe is no different. Both projects hold one thing in common. They are gospels of the current African reality. They are African pain, celebration, walking into the streets of Ghana, understanding these commonalities between Ghana and the rest of the world, teaching the rest of the world that we're not stuck in some primal age where not much of the common and current world is existent in Africa, where really Africa is as futuristic as many other nations. Africa is as forward-thinking, as progressive as the rest of the world, and that our current political climate is a direct result of the legacy of Europe's hands still embedded within African ambitions. And M.anifest is able to make his music overtly political without it being pedantic. He doesn't try to teach, he happens to teach. His music is a rhythmic, melodious swing of celebration, more than it is a real centered and dry account of things as they are. He speaks with an open, fluid perspective that invites you into understanding and experience of a common Africa. And as a South African, I love hearing the narratives that tie us together. The man, though rapping with a unique accent that is a combination of his time in America and in Ghana, so it speaks to a very modern and broad, applicable way of communicating, but at the very same time, his language and his vernacular is kept at home. He doesn't try to use terms that are not familiar to him just because they're trendy. He doesn't try to sound like he's from the South or Detroit. He literally takes the experiences that he's had and he raps the way that he speaks. And with the sonic palette of the first Madina To The Universe, he basically keeps it in this place of boom bap turned Afro beats, and he's able to take that mixture and turn it into an alchemy of new African rap that at most times hits on the money, because it's songs that you can dance to, but they are strung along to simple, infectious lines that are easy to really catch. But here's the thing, sometimes M.anifest goes too easy on the pen. You can tell that in his approach to songwriting. His understanding of a good song is a song needs to be simple and rhythmic. Sometimes his lyrics tend to be too simplistic, like they border into corny. They border into metaphors and ways of explaining things that are somewhat along typical tropes and show a very restrained imagination. But I think that's just the byproduct of a poet who's struggling to funnel himself into a very, very thin channel of expression, because commercial music hardly leaves any room for writers to express themselves openly and fully. And what M.anifest is first is a writer, and I think he sacrifices that a lot with the music he tries to make. He limits the amount of his verses to something that's going to be caught by the audience, but he also limits his intellect and to a large extent his broad capacity of aesthetic and imaginative qualities, because he understands that he's a bridge between three things. Between one, people understanding Ghana, people understanding Africa, but also people understanding that globally we are all one. So M.anifest tries to tell all these three stories in ways that could speak to all three audiences, and I get why a lot of the songs will feel like your run-of-the-mill hook that you might have heard before, but the saving grace is that the rhythms are always situated in a place where they're distinctly African, and it's no wonder that in America he's revered and seen as one of the iconic representations of African rap as it lives and thrives in the continent, because he's been able to take his engagement with the United States and make it work on terms that empower Africa. And I think that's the most important thing about this review. If you want to leave anything about what M.anifest is as an artist and how he translates his music across, it's always to empower the continent, his people first, as in Ghana, but the continent in general. So I think even moving into the epilogue, what he then does is that he makes it dancier. If the first Madina To The Universe is more of an introduction into the highs and lows, what this one really is a pure all-out celebration. So the only differences in the two is that this one is more high peak. The songs here are more funneled towards dance. It's brief, it's an EP. So the album is the story, and I guess the EP is a moment in what has concluded after the story, because what the story is the continuing tale of Africa's takeover in the rest of the world. So ultimately, 2 ratings. The first Madina To The Universe is a strong 7.5 to 8 out of 10. Again, that 3 is because sometimes the songs tend to feel like one elongated experience and there's not much distinction, and again the lyrics tend to be sometimes oversimplified. I'm not saying he's whack, I am saying he has moments where he's very typical in his delivery, and you and I both know, if we've listened to the man, that he can do way more. He's experimented in sonic palettes outside of his own music, working with the likes of Erykah Badu, artists from all over the continent and the world in general. So if you look at just his repertoire, we know that M.anifest is capable of a whole lot, but it feels like when it comes to his own catalog, he chooses to stay within the safe zone so that as he experiments, he's able to channel into commercial value, whereas he allows the stuff he does outside to be seen kind of from a passion project place, where he allows himself to play a little bit more with other artists, showing the depth and the range of who he is as an artist. And the second EP, the epilogue, Madina To The Universe, definitely gonna give that one a solid 7 as well. It's shorter, it's a continuation, so all in all, it's one project to me. It just feels like he didn't want to make it so long that the track listing goes in the way into the 20s. He wanted to cut the story in 2 parts to tell an honest representation of where he was within the short space of a couple of months, because one is 2021, the other is 2022. So the reality is, this is really the same time span. It's a rapper kind of in the close edge of his own retirement. He's beyond the time of peak. He's a millennial. He's somebody who's amassed a lot, achieved a lot, from being recognized by the rest of the world, respected by his own people, from down to the south to north of Africa. He's somebody who's had every classical aspects of a rapper's story, from the guts, the glory, the beefs, shout out Sarkodie. He's somebody who has basically lived the life of a successful rapper, and it's way more important because a successful rapper in Africa. And yes, the successful rapper does happen to live between Minneapolis and Accra, but that only means that he uses his privilege and his influence in ways that can empower the continent in general and can return the glory back to Africa. It beckons me back to a lot of the interpretations of Africa we get from American movies. Ever notice, whether it's Coming to America, whether it's The Lion King, whether it's Beasts of No Nation, or whether it's Black Panther, there's always something in an American movie that tries to tell the story of Africa that still gives America the glory. Whether it's T'Challa opening the gates up to the West for the first time, whether it's Prince Hakeem only finding a woman in New York, because my God, there couldn't have been one worthy woman in Zamunda. Whether it's the constant stories of war that undermine the peace that we're able to engage with in Africa, where we need foreign aid to help us. Americans always want to tell the story of an Africa that needs their help. And I think with artists like M.anifest, we realize that not only is that bullshit, it's a fiction of the highest proportions. Yes, we are a continent that has been, and still is, under the strong grip of European ambition. But I feel together, when we understand the power of our culture, through our art, through our music, and eventually through our politics, because art is a vehicle through which the views of the people and the spirit of the people emanate and are expressed to the rest of the world. So we say salute to artists like M.anifest, who show us what's really happening and who use the system to their own advantage. They use capitalism's need for an African brand, capitalism's need for a smiling black all-African face, but they conceal their true needs of being revolutionaries for a hope and a tomorrow. So M.anifest is a man who plays his cards safe, but he definitely plays his cards right. Because he understands that although he has to make music which very much often falls into the category of typical, the rest of the art is able to speak for something phenomenal. And if that is not a lesson to Africa, to rappers, and to hip-hop as a whole, I don't know what is. Shout out to M.anifest, we're all African.